Creating a master study using a complement set and satellite hues. This is our third and final part where we begin adding in our satellite hues. Before I begin, I'm going to take my palette knife and gently scrape the surface of the painting, preparing it for a whole nother layer of decision making. This can happen at the very end of a painting session, or in my case here, where I had left the painting overnight and I'm scraping it now just before another painting session is going to occur. Additionally, in preparation for this next stage, I'm going to reassert those original geometric gridded divisions that correspond to my master study. These guidelines continue to be useful as we add on new information. Okay, you guys, we're going to start on part 3 here, and first I need to remix my warm tertiary and my cool tertiary using my same complement set because I've run out of paint and it kind of dried and got nasty. And so I want my paint to be nice and fresh because I'm going to be using a lot of it to then satellite other colors into. So again, I'm going to start by neutralizing my complement sets. I'm going to first make my warm tertiary by taking a lot of orange and putting a little bit of blue in it. And then I'll do the same with the blue and put a little bit of orange in it. So I've got a warm tertiary and a cool tertiary. And then I'll mix my 2 additional values of each so that we end up with that same grid of 6 differences. 3 warm tertiary values and 3 cooler tertiary values. Now that I've mixed my tertiaries and my values, I'm going to consolidate my piles and place them a little closer to each other on my palette, and with my razor blade, clean up around them and create more space around these tertiaries on my palette, as I'm going to need that for all the new mixtures that I'm going to be making. So go ahead and consolidate your piles, clean up your palette, put your grid nice and close to each other, and make sure you have a lot of room around that grid for new mixtures. Now that my palette is nice and tidy, I'm going to go back to my original dyad and place a little blob of my cadmium orange near my warm tertiaries and my phthalo blue near my cool tertiaries. Then I'm going to take my white paint and just put a few blobs of it around the bottom of my palette in order to access for additional mixtures. I'm now going to extend my palette by first taking a little swatch of my middle value cool tertiary and adding a little bit more of the original phthalo blue to it, creating a more saturated or intense version of that cool middle value neutral. I'm going to do the same with my middle value warm tertiary, adding its original cad orange to it to make a more saturated or intense version of that middle value warm neutral. And here's what our palette looks like right now, with our grid of 6 tertiaries, 3 on the left, the warmer tertiaries, and 3 on the right, the cooler tertiaries, with a more saturated version of each of them on the side. Now we're going to take a moment just for a little bit of color theory review so that we can have an understanding of where exactly within the color wheel we are working and how we're going to expand outwards from the limited palette we've been using. For those of you that color theory is new to, or that could use a more in-depth review, do not despair. My whole color theory curriculum will soon be online for you to subscribe to, so stay tuned. Our primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. They are our primaries because we cannot mix them. How do you make red? How do you make yellow? In theory, all of our other colors are made up out of some mixture of these 3 primary colors. Our secondary colors are made up by mixing 2 primary colors. Orange being made from red and yellow, green is made from yellow and blue, violet is made from red and blue. Our complement sets are made up of the 3 primaries, meaning red plus green is really red plus yellow plus blue. Orange and blue is really yellow plus red plus blue. And yellow and violet are actually yellow plus red plus blue. So each complement set is actually comprised of a primary and the secondary that is comprised of the other 2 primaries. When we mix our complement sets together, or another way of saying that is, when we mix our 3 primaries together, we end up neutralizing the color and ending up in the center of the color wheel. The complement set that I've chosen for this exercise is orange and blue. Complement sets sit exactly opposed from each other on the color wheel, or as far away from each other on the wheel as they can get. As you can see highlighted here is the cross-section of the color wheel that is particular to the orange-blue complement set. This is the particular cross-section of the color wheel that I'm using for this exercise. When we mix our complement sets to each other, we begin neutralizing our colors, and all of those colors that exist on those inner rungs of the color wheel are called tertiaries. Tertii meaning 3, meaning made up in some part from the 3 primaries. This particular cross-section shows the particular type of tertiaries or neutrals that you can get from an orange-blue complement set. Now, if we take that cross-section of tertiaries and expand on it simply by adding white to each of those colors, we create a value scale of each of our tertiaries, going from warm to cool. For this exercise, I had you guys simply mix one warm tertiary and one cooler tertiary that may have looked something like this, or in my case, something a little bit more like this. 3 values of a warm tertiary, 3 values of a cool tertiary, creating a limited temperature palette. Now, to prepare our palette for this next step in our exercise, we'll take our complement set, orange-blue in my case, the warm and cool tertiaries that we mixed between them, and then we'll be adding onto our palette any saturated outer rung hues to use as satellites to bring into our complement set cross-section. Any pigments are fair game for you to use as satellite hues. You'll see me here placing a cadmium red, a quinacridone magenta, a dioxazine violet, a cadmium yellow, an ultramarine blue, and a phthalo green to use as my satellite hues. I chose these because they are all very intense, very saturated. Let's return now to our exercise where we add in these same satellite hues onto our palette. Again, we've got our grid of 6 tertiaries with extensions. Now we're adding on those same pigments on the outer rung of our palette surrounding our orange-blue cross-section of tertiaries. I'm arranging my pigments in a rainbow arc around my tertiaries. My red, orange, yellow on the left side near my warm tertiaries, and my greens, blues, and violets on the right side near my cooler tertiaries. This organization of the palette will help us as we begin to make our color decisions. Here are the pigments that I've chosen to use as my satellite colors. Starting in the lower left, cadmium red to cadmium orange to cadmium yellow. Up top I have phthalo green, and then phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, dioxazine violet, and finally quinacridone magenta. No need to be too concerned with matching the same exact pigments that I am using. Find your own equivalents with the paints that you have on hand. We'll be using this palette organization in order to mix our equivalent colors based on the relationship of the master study that we're viewing. In creating our color mixtures, we're going to be asking ourselves 4 questions for every shape of color that we attempt to mix and apply. The 4 questions that are going to help guide our decisions on the palette include: what hue is it? Meaning, what color is that shape that I'm viewing? Is it closer to red, orange, yellow, green, blue, or violet? And next, what value is that shape of color? How light or how dark is it compared to the other shapes in the composition? And next, what temperature is it? Is it a lighter, warmer part of that color, or is it a cooler tone? And finally, how intense is the color I'm looking at? Meaning, how neutral or how saturated is that color? Understanding and applying these 4 principles of color to every mixture that you make will help you develop a strong, confident, usable vocabulary for color. The first mixture I'm going to make on my palette is going to be a response to this very saturated red fabric that is prominent in the study I'm looking at. Every color that I mix for this particular exercise is going to begin with one of my 6 original tertiaries mixed from my orange-blue complement set. If every color I mix has one of these tertiaries involved in its mixture, then what I'm doing is ensuring that all of the colors I mix will be harmonious. In order to begin the mixture in response to that red cloth, I've chosen my middle value warm tertiary to get me started, as that cloth is neither my darkest nor my lightest. It's a warm color, and it is red in hue. So I'm satelliting my red into my warm tertiary and mixing that up. That fabric in the Rubens is certainly very saturated and rich, and so I can add as much or as little of the red paint that I want to create an equivalent. To start with, I often will have it be a little bit more tertiary than I think I might eventually want, just to kind of ease my painting into the colors that I see. And I can always add in more of those saturated pigments during the process of working. This mixture here is a good starting place for approaching the warmer, lighter parts of that red fabric. And so next I'll attempt to do a mixture that'll be a good starting place for the darker, somewhat cooler shadows that occur on that same fabric. And so I've simply taken some of that original reddish mixture, and now I'm cooling it down with some magenta. But I need a little bit more contrast. So I'm placing in some of my dioxazine violet, which is both cooling it down and making it a darker color. Making that mixture makes me hunger for even a little bit more contrast between the two versions of that red cloth, and so I'm going ahead and putting a little bit more of my cadmium red in to really show the difference between the warmer, lighter version and the cooler, darker version. I'm now going to focus in on some of the lighter value, warmer colors in the Rubens. In particular, the differences that happen on some of the areas of flesh. For instance, the torso on the right-hand side appears a little yellower or greener, whereas the torso here on the left is a little bit oranger. Both of these colors are light in value and warm, so I'm starting with my light, warm tertiary, and I'm making one mixture where I'm adding some yellow and some orange into it. And I'll continue making several different mixtures that seem good equivalents or starting places for all the different kind of warm flesh tones I see in the picture. This one here, I'm starting with that original oranger extension, a bit more of a middle value, placing more of my orange into it. And taking a little bit of that and adding white so that I have a lighter version as well, adding a little more yellow, a little more orange, creating a little bit more of a saturated, recognizable, warm hue. And while I'm working on these lighter value, warm colors, I might as well go ahead and move towards the center of the composition and observe how the protagonist female in the center and the cherubim baby that she's clutching are both a light pinker warm. So a warm with a little bit more red in it, as compared to those yellower, oranger colors from the male torsos I had previously mixed. Making myself a middle value, reddish, warm, and going ahead and making an even lighter, pinkish, cherubim-like color. And I suppose for good measure, I'll go ahead and place in a lighter oranger yellow version. Now that I have my light pink color, I can really see this in contrast to that. And no, probably I'm going to want this option of a warm light as well. Next, I want to focus in on some of the wonderful, rich darks in this painting. Notice here in the upper right-hand corner of the composition, those warm, purpley, reddish darks, but also the bluer, coolish darks. So starting with those warm darks, I'll take from my warmest, darkest tertiary pile and begin satelliting different colors into it. Taking some of it to the side and adding in some dioxazine violet, which will make it nice and purple, will also make it richer and darker. That will very likely be a useful color to me throughout the process of this painting. I'll also be needing some dark, colder colors, so I'll start with my darkest cool tertiary and begin satelliting any of my darker cool tones into it. Here I'm placing in some more of the phthalo blue, some of the ultramarine blue. And while I'm thinking about cools, I'm going to zoom in and create an equivalent of this lighter value cool color that appears in the composition. So I'm going to begin with my lightest value cool tertiary. And I want to be able to show the difference between a warm, light area of that cool cloth, for instance, where the warm sunlight is hitting it, versus a cooler, darker version of that same colored cloth. So I'm adding in some ultramarine and dioxazine, and that got to be a pretty saturated kind of periwinkle purple. Not sure where that'll go in the composition, but it's a lovely color and I hope to find a use for it. I'll go ahead and create another mixture, which is a little bit more what I had in mind. A kind of dark bluish tone that will act as a good shadow on that same cloth. And finally, I'm going to zoom in on the wonderful tertiary that creates the ground plane in this composition. To me, it appears to be a very greenish kind of gray. And so I'm going to start with my middle value warm tertiary and add a little bit of yellow and a little bit of green to it, just to make sure that it reads as a kind of greenish hue, but not too saturated, still very much a neutralized tertiary mixture. And now that I've analyzed and created equivalent mixtures of some of the main colors that I observe in the Rubens, I'm ready to go ahead and get started painting. For this third and final layer of the painting, I'm going to add a little bit of linseed oil to my odorless mineral spirits in order to make the paint a little bit more fluid and a little bit more luscious. Also, at this point, I'm going to be switching my brushes to some smooth rounds. These happen to be faux mongoose. They're quite smooth, and so unlike the bristly scumble brushes I used for the first and second layer, which really push the paint around, these are going to more gently caress the surface of the painting as I apply my rich darks and all of my new color mixtures to the surface. I now want to remind you, very importantly, to keep it abstract. We are by no means doing a master study that is about minute detail or modeling of the figures, but rather we are doing an impression or a response to the choreography of the formal visual relationships: color, value, shape, gesture, rhythm, and patterning. So keep it abstract, just shapes of color, no blending, no figure painting or modeling. Just look for rhythm and patterns of color. Also, keep in mind this is an advanced exercise. So if you are struggling, you can always go back to your value study and reassert your lights and darks. If transitioning into satellite hues is overwhelming, start with just one additional color to add into your complement set. And scrape down and regrid your study as often as you like to maintain a workable surface and a feeling of control and confidence. And lastly, having fun is the primary concern here. So stop your unnecessary temper tantrum and just paint and see what happens. All right already, can we finally paint? I'm going to stop talking until the very end of this video. So from here on out, it's all going to be visual. Turn on your favorite music and work. Hey you, have you organized and cleaned your palette? Hey you, have you cleaned and organized your palette in a while? And here we are, at the end of part 3, and at the conclusion of this exercise, creating a master study using a complement set and satellite hues. I look forward to hearing from you in my comments section, and please stay tuned for an extra short bonus video that will show my very final touches to this piece, as well as a link for purchasing this demonstration. Until next time, thank you so much for joining me for a Top Hat Studio demonstration.